pleasure to see that this initiative has attracted a lot of attention and that we have a very good participation today. I do hope that the debate that will take place today will contribute in a positive way to the current debate on how to shape efficient policies to drive the process of infrastructure developments in the EU, probably the most important pillar of the European digital agenda. As you are aware, ETNO members are fully committed to pursue the digital agenda targets. But what we have to understand that in today's difficult economic context for the sector and faced with a revenue decline for the third year in a row, what is needed is a proactive policy that reassures investors and reinforces the principles of technology neutrality, infrastructure competition, as well as regulatory certainty.
In the internet revenue streams that I mentioned, actually changes the architecture of not only the network but also the revenues. And it could be argued that the ways the revenues is accrued on the internet is imbalanced because of the disconnect between those who generate traffic and those who carry it. And there are various views, of course, in this assembly today about what that depends on and the implications. But it has created a problem for the ability of European telecom operators to attract infrastructure investment. And that's something we see clearly also from our interviews with investors. So at the core of the problem for further infrastructure investments is the changing character as well as the growth of network traffic. And I see we have at least one investor on the panel, so I'm sure he could go more into depth of that. But obviously we see high dividends being paid out currently by telecom companies because the shareholders don't think there is enough perspective for long-term growth in investments, and that's of course a problem. So these are the types of issues we've been dealing with, and personally, maybe I speak more for myself now than my research team at the LSE, I feel that the debate is going a lot into volume and traffic volume, but there is also a quality issue of the broadband debate and IT. Last week we launched a report on cloud computing here in Brussels, where Commissioner Cruz was also present at that event. And there was some concern among the cloud providers, which you probably know most of them are American companies. We don't have much of that industry in Europe, unfortunately, that the network is becoming, they sense that it is becoming an obstacle for them in their efforts in rolling out cloud computing.
Trends, cash flow and the health of the balance sheet matter in addition to a net present value kind of estimate of what the investment is worth. And in particular that lowering the price of copper would be harmful in the following ways. It would undermine regulatory credibility, and I think that's extremely important because it raises the prospect of the same thing happening with fibre once the fibre investment is made. So naturally, as an investor, that makes you extra cautious about that investment. That increases the take-up from this coverage of 11, not the take-up, the coverage from 11% up another 10 percentage points. Then we have a hurdle rate impact here, which we take as positive in the sense that an increase in the price of copper is assumed here, and our assumption is that that would be positive for investors who have had a long history of price declines, are naturally suspicious about how fibre investment will be regulated in the future, assuming it is regulated, and that therefore potentially perhaps a modest increase in the price of copper would send a very different signal to the market. The last slide, these are some thoughts. It's a little complicated looking. It's not that complicated about how you might go forward in Europe. It's a contingent approach. You're doing different things at different times depending on circumstances. But just from left to right, the first question one should always ask is platform competition sufficient? If it is, there are grounds for removing regulation. And so I think we just have to keep testing that question. If the answer to that question is no, then what I would suggest is something pretty close to the status quo for copper. Changing the methodology, particularly changing the methodology in order to lower the price, will be, I think, quite harmful in terms of investor expectations and in terms of incentives. And therefore there is a good case for staying with the status quo, which is predominantly replacement cost. That methodology also has the advantage that it sends the right kinds of signals to entrants and other platforms in terms of investment decisions. There is an issue as people migrate from copper to fibre about falling volumes, and there is a concern that has been expressed that the price for the customers who remain would escalate. And you can imagine the last household on DSL paying millions of euros or something ridiculous like that. Now, I'm not sure that concern, that there really would be as big a problem as some imagine, because a lot of the costs are common costs and would migrate across to the fibre side over time as those customers move. But if it were a significant problem, first of all, being able to cut the costs of running the copper network, so the option but not an obligation to remove copper from service will help. But potentially one might get to the position where it was, I suppose, politically unacceptable to see prices rise to the point they might otherwise rise to. And you might move to a kind of safety cap, not cost-oriented necessarily anymore, but just an RPI, and I would say plus. Why plus? Why should the price be going up over time? Well, partly because of the signals it sends to investors now, but partly because you do want both customers and the people who have unbundled copper lines ultimately will have to migrate to a different model. So it's a signal to them to move, actually. On the fibre case, I've got two quite different options down here, and I think both are worth considering. Indeed, both might be on the table at the same time as an option. On the left-hand side, if copper and fibre or next generation access are judged to be weak substitutes, i.e. people have a strong preference for the fibre, and therefore copper is no longer a discipline on what you can charge those customers, then you might move to something that's close to what was done in the Netherlands, which is look at the investment over its life, do a discounted cash flow analysis, work out what the prices have to be with some demand assumptions. You have to make a lot of heroic assumptions to do this, but price not in the kind of short term, but over the life of the asset, if you like. So continue to apply regulation, but do it in an intelligent way. Quite challenging, but it could be done. On the right-hand side is quite a different approach, and that says maybe copper and next-generation access are relatively strong substitutes. In other words, the regulated price of copper will be sufficient discipline on the exercise of market power. And this is all assuming that platform competition itself is not sufficient discipline. In a sense, there is platform competition between current and next-generation access, even if they're owned by the same investor, because one is regulated. And here the idea is that perhaps you don't need to regulate the fibre products, and that's the position in the UK. BT are investing under an Ofcom agreement that the fibre product, they're free to price the fibre products and to decide what those products are. You might, if you were removing the copper, get to the point where copper itself was not in the market, and then there is then the possibility that you introduce what has been called an anchor product or an anchor price, where you have a virtual product on fibre which is like copper. So maybe it's 5-10 megabits per second at a price very close to what people paid before. And that's a way of migrating the customers who are not willing to pay a premium across to the new technology. And also means that you can leave the other prices unregulated, so long as that anchor product is sufficient discipline. So those are some thoughts. There will be, in practice, more to it than that, about a possible way forward. And I'll stop there.
More serious, I think that the first thing I would like to say is it seems that we can only stop and not finish. So I think that I feel less conclusion. This is a place to conclude, but I feel less conclusion and more confusion. So, and without going into the details, in pricing, what is the role of regulator, whether the recommendation goal is in line really with the digital agenda, what should be done with the digital agenda instead. So I can name I can be long on the list. And the confusion drives me to the next point, which is hope. And this was rather to say to Reinhard, but we can say it personally as well. The hope is when I was a regulator and a little bit policymaker, when you find yourself in a situation like this, there are more confusion than conclusion, then we need time. Even if it seems like it's been 2 years. I left the Brussels scene, but it's like yesterday. So
We'll come back.
so it means that since like 2 years, nothing really happened on this. But this is, as Magnus said, this is all between us. So anyway, I think we still need some time. I think all the stakeholders at the industry to get a little bit more conclusion, then less confusion. And that leads us, I think, and to me, to my last point, is the homework. I think the policymakers has a homework as well to be, I think, more clear on what exactly are the objectives of the measures being proposed, and how they are in line of really with the objectives, and how is it really backed. And we as stakeholders, and of course I should speak in the name of ETNO, I think we also have the homework to come up maybe with a 3-point idea, as Stephen did, of how we think, then if we believe that this is not the way to boost the digital agenda, then what else? And also, if we believe that this is not a recommendation which will enable the whole Europe to get closer to the digital agenda, then what else? So I think this is, let's say, the homework of ETNO, which should be done in the coming weeks, and then all the help what you can offer is welcome. And again, thank you very much for you, and hope we can continue in another time. Thank you very much.